Welcome to the Transforming Trauma podcast. Transforming Trauma is presented by the Complex Trauma Training Center. I'm your host, Emily Ruth, and I'm so glad you've joined us today. Hi, Transforming Trauma listeners. If you're a mental health professional working with complex trauma and are interested in learning the neuroaffective relational model, we're excited to share with you about our upcoming NARM therapist trainings. The NARM therapist training is an advanced clinical training designed for licensed mental health professionals, current mental health graduate students, and active clinical interns and trainees, where you will get trained in a comprehensive developmental framework and clinical approach for resolving the long-term impacts of ACEs and CPTSD. As you are learning and integrating NARM, you will receive individualized support from a team of skilled, passionate, and supportive trainers led by faculty members Brad Kammer, Stephanie Klein, and Marcia Black. If you are working in the field of complex trauma, we encourage you to register now to get trained in NARM. For more information and to reserve your spot, please visit www.complextraumatrainingcenter.com. And now for our interview. Vanessa R. Brooks is a doctoral candidate studying the efficacy of mental health training intervention for African American clergy. Vanessa is the owner of Brooks Consulting and Training Solutions, a personal development and emotional wellness company. In her research, Vanessa studies mental health and the Black church and the need for evidence-based mental health counseling methods to be integrated with biblical counseling. Please enjoy this conversation with Vanessa R. Brooks. Okay, Vanessa R. Brooks, welcome to Transforming Trauma.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, we're so excited to have this conversation. The first thing we always ask really our guests is, what would you like our listeners to get out of our time together today?
Sure. So the work that I focus on is, I think, what I'd like for people to sort of hear today. And that is giving voice to communities that have experienced disparities in terms of their faith and in terms of mental health and in terms of how to reconstruct their life after experiencing religious deconstruction and or trauma. So just giving space to those marginalized voices.
Yeah, I'm excited to dive in.
Yeah.
So could you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got into this work that you're doing?
Absolutely. I'm a church girl, so I've been in the church all my life. I was raised by a wonderful woman who going to church was just part of our life, as it is for a lot of African Americans in the deep South where I was raised. And after a lifetime of setbacks and trials and tribulations, I started to sort of get my life on track, and education became really, really, really important to me. Mental health education became extremely important to me after becoming so engulfed in religion. I now realized that I was a fanatic when it came to religion. And so trying to navigate my life after deconstructing from religion proved to be challenging. And so I got into this work because of my own life, trying to figure out how to reconfigure my own life. And I realized, or at least I believed and thought that there were other people who probably were in the same situation. I know how isolating it was for me and alienating it was for me, deconstructing as a Black woman in the South. And I felt like there were other people who perhaps were going through the same situation. So I wanted to combine my absolute obsession with mental health education and spirituality and take that information and empower people in my community. So that's how I ended up here. I was a pastor as well. And so after closing my church in 2019, I ended up, my life just spiraled. It completely crashed. Right before COVID, I went through so much anxiety and so much depression. And so just trying to navigate through that world was challenging, but I wanted to help other people to do the same thing once I figured out how to recover myself. So that's kind of how I got here in a nutshell.
Can I ask specifically, was it really close to COVID, or is it the end of 2019, or when during that year?
It was actually 10 months before COVID. And I had this overwhelming, if I was, I would have called that voice God, and I probably would still say it's God in my own way. But I had this overwhelming internal voice, probably 2 years prior, just saying, it's time for you to let this go. It's time for you to bring this phase of your spiritual journey to an end, because this is causing you to not be well. And I didn't have the word religious trauma at that time. So I just couldn't do it anymore. I told my husband, I just cannot physically get up and do this anymore. So that was about 10 months prior to COVID coming into the
Mm.
world, which I'm actually grateful for. I can't imagine being a pastor during COVID and having to make those difficult decisions. But yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that's actually part of why I asked that question is I've talked to a few folks who started to deconstruct during COVID, and what a few people have said is that they actually appreciated the space. They actually kind of appreciated being able to step back and not, have the weekly kind of interaction, because it gave them space to really think about what it was that they wanted and needed from a
Absolutely.
spiritual perspective. So I was curious, for
Hmm.
you really started that process before there was that space.
Before
Hmm.
I went through COVID before anybody else did.
Yeah, you were isolated.
I was a trailblazer. I went through COVID deconstruction before the rest of the world did, because I found myself for the first time at that time I was 49. So for the first time in, well over 40 years, I was at home every week, because I promise you, I had never missed a Sunday from attending church in forever. It was all I knew. And so now for the first time in my life, I'm at home and it's nobody. It's just me and all these voices and all these memories and all these questions. So it was a lot to take in.
Yeah. Okay. So you said that education became very important to you, and you spoke specifically about mental health.
Hmm.
Can you speak a little bit more about that?
Sure. So I was a pastor. And so prior to that, of course, I had this love-hate relationship with school. I
Mm.
had been a college dropout, forever. I finally went back to school in my 30s. But when I became a pastor, I realized that preaching and praying and caring for people, as much as it was heart centered, it was not helping the people in a lasting way. And I said to God, okay, I said, something's wrong here. There's something you haven't told me. Because when I tell you that I literally had given people all I had to give them, there was nothing else left to give them. And so I got this impression that I needed to go back to school again. I already had a bachelor's degree in human services. This time, my instructions from the divine was to go and study pastoral counseling, right? Because that was going to open me up to a world that I had not been exposed to before. Of course, I didn't know it at that time, because pastoral counseling is a combination of psychotherapy and theology. And so when I went through this program, I was floored, because it was at that time that I began to learn about things like trauma and, you know, emotional wellness and psycho-spiritual, wellness. And it was at that time that I realized, oh, this is what's missing from the church,
Mm.
because the faith that I was a part of, which was a very radical Pentecostal, type of faith, it was the only way that you could ever get free from anything was through this very radical evangelical deliverance ministry, where we believed in demons. We believed in casting out demons. We believed in all of the deliverance ministry. And so if there was anything that we thought was what we now call mental health, we would call that demonic possession in the church.
Mm.
And so we got to pray that out. And so when I went to school and I began to learn about depression and anxiety and the etiology of these diseases, and a way to look at these diseases through a completely different lens, looking at these diseases through the lens of science and biology and not through the lens of religion, was absolutely something that I had never, ever, ever been exposed to in my life. And I had
Mm.
this overwhelming desire to share this knowledge with the church. But to my dismay and to my unfortunate surprise, the church wasn't having it.
Mm.
People were very resistant to this new message that I was trying to bring, where I wanted to integrate, psychological theory with our spirituality. Because in my mind, these two schools of thought could coexist in my mind. Well,
Hmm. Hmm.
the church wasn't having that.
Mm.
I was I was called everything except what my mama named me. So that's sort of what led me into realizing that, oh, I'm going to have to take this information out of the church, because the church just was not really receptive to entertaining psychological theory with their theological approaches. And so the work proved to be challenging at that time. But things have gotten better, and you can ask me about that if you want to.
Yeah.
But that's kind of how it all got started.
Yeah, I would love to hear more. I'm curious. A few things you said, I'm thinking of, again, some folks that I've talked to, and this idea of like prosperity gospel really doesn't line up. If you're doing all the right things and you're following all the rules, then you're going to do well. And so the idea of mental illness is like, no, it must be because you did something wrong. I mean, that's how I've heard it spoken about. So I wondered if that was a part of your experience, some of the resistance.
Absolutely. Absolutely. The thought is that if you are sin-free, if you are living right, and I'm putting that in quotations, if you are living this holy life, a life that's pleasing before God, there would be no mental illness.
Mm-hmm.
The problem with that is it completely removes an individual from reality. And so what happens is when people are in the real world, when the church service is over, we have to go back to the real world. And so when people leave the church service and they're no longer in that environment and they have to face life, problems, challenges, what's going to linger inside of them is the voice of what was preached in the church. So the individual is going to say to themselves, well, I'm assuming I'm going through this thing because I wasn't able to master my prayer life. I wasn't able to master, being sin free. And so this creates this cycle then of I'm going to keep going to church because there's something I'm not doing right. And I'm going to keep spiraling into mental illness, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
So what I'm trying to do is stop that cycle. And I'm trying to help individuals to balance out those two worlds of, yes, I think you can have a healthy spiritual life and also have a healthy mental life as well.
Mm-hmm.
And so my motto is my spirituality has to keep me sane, right?
Mm-hmm.
Sanity and mental wellness go hand in hand with spirituality for me.
Mm-hmm.
But what I've witnessed, in African-American cultures, and I'm talking about those African-American individuals who practice this radical form of evangelical Pentecostal religion, where there is a constant warring with this world of darkness, where they almost prefer, and I'm not trying to be disrespectful to my community at all, because I live that world, but there's almost this preference to believe that I'm having this mental illness because a demon is possessing me than to actually say, maybe there's something else going on. Maybe I have unresolved trauma. Maybe I have repressed, memories. They'd rather almost just believe it's something demonic possessing them rather than have to face the repressed things that might be going on within them. And that makes me really sad.
Yeah.
You mentioned that if you haven't mentioned, I'm going to mention, I'm a doctoral candidate, and I'm in my last year of doctoral school, and I'm studying mental health in the African American church, and I'm using African American clergy as my participants. And so a lot of them are talking about this conversation. My study is around, I want to analyze clergy's perception of integrating evidence-based practices with their biblical and theological practices, and how open they are to that. Because there's a huge boundary there where the theology is so pronounced and it's so determined to keep God at the forefront that it doesn't sometimes leave room for integration. It doesn't leave room for other schools of thought. And so trying to introduce these concepts to the African American community without taking their love for religion out is challenging. When I did the conference with Darren Slade, which is how I think you got connected to me, I talked about, like, you have to understand that the connection with our community in the church is a very old relationship. You have to start thinking about our history with slavery and how African Americans had to rely on, they used to call it church in the woods, because slave masters wouldn't permit them to worship in the way that was healthy for them. So they would have to go down and have like secret worship services as a way to release what we now would call trauma from being so, abused from slave masters and experiencing all of the rapes that they experienced and all of the beatings and the anti-human, dehumaning practices that they experienced. So they would go down into the woods. They'd have these secret church services and they would scream and they would shout and they would holler and they would sing songs for hours and they would clap and they would pray to God and they would beg God for help. They were so focused on going to heaven because in their mind, focusing on the future kept them from having to deal with the pain of their present.
Oh, yeah.
And so then when you study things like epigenetics, and you understand that even emotional trauma can be inherited from generations back.
Mm-hmm.
It would make sense now that as African American believers, we still have that trauma in our DNA that makes us more inclined to focus on oppression, where it's almost glorified.
Mm.
We focus on this futuristic time with God. So there's a lot. And so even with me, when people I get a lot of backlash, right?
Mm.
And so there's always, it never fails. What I get from people is, you're going to go to hell for what you're saying.
Mm.
I'm not offended because I understand, right? Because the trauma that we're experiencing keeps us focused on punishment and this sort of futuristic experience with God. So it was either let's shout because we're going to go to heaven, or let's holler and scream and try to make sure we don't go to hell.
Mm.
Let's do everything right so we don't go to hell. That's why it becomes very difficult to talk about spirituality in a healthy way
Mm-hmm.
in these types of communities, which is why my approach is, okay, let's start talking about religious trauma first.
Mm.
I couldn't figure it out at first. I couldn't understand when I first started doing this work. I was like, let me just teach you all about spirituality. But no, I understood they're not going to be able to even have a healthy spiritual experience because of the trauma that this authoritative type of religion has caused.
Mm. And what just keeps coming up to me is my heart, and I can't remember exactly how you said it, but this idea of someone that is experiencing, they've had trauma, and so they're experiencing a mental health. There's various ways of describing it, but they're struggling with their mental health. So they already have this trauma, and then to sort of have this extra layer of shame of like, you must not be doing enough. You must have a demon inside of you.
Mm-hmm.
That added layer of shame is just re-traumatizing. So there's this horrible cycle that I'm hearing you describe that my heart just,
It's vicious.
I felt that as you were talking about it.
It's vicious. One of the pastors that I was interviewing for my study the other day, she said, because I didn't know what else to do and I don't know what else to do, I keep the people in church. So we're in church 7 days a week. She says, I know the people have mental health issues. I know they have, battles with depression. I can see it. But because we have this very evangelical, rigid belief around not seeking outside help, in my mind, she said, if I keep them in church, that's how I'm treating their mental health.
Mm.
Meanwhile, the person's getting worse. And so I have to get, clergy to understand, the more you beat people with this sort of demonic possession concept, the more they're going to spiral in that cycle. So you're not going to get any relief. They're not going to get any relief. We have a problem. And so when I talk to the church about depression rates in the African American community, how alarming they are, the suicide rates in the African American community, how alarming they are, they're staggering. Hardly anybody talks about it.
Mm-hmm.
No disrespect, but most of the time when we see people talk about depression, I usually see a Caucasian person or, a white person,
Mm-hmm.
Where even in the media, wherever it is, it's rarely about us, because there is this silent message from white people and from African American people that you're not dealing with anything. You're resilient. You can do it. You can take it. You're strong. And so when I talk to Black people, and they'll tell you, this is in our culture, we're expected to be strong and resilient. Right? When you look at the studies of how even white doctors used to use us for their experiments, because they, in their mind, we could take pain. And so they wouldn't even give us, pain medication. So all of this stigma is so deeply ingrained, even within us as African American people like me who want to help and want to do this work. We have to find innovative ways to have this conversation. So for me, when I was deconstructing, I knew that they were not going to listen to me if I did not incorporate God and the Bible in my message.
Yeah.
Because again, there's this very old relationship that we have with the church. And so I had to figure out ways to innovatively introduce my community to healing the trauma without using words that would further traumatize them, which is why you have to be trauma informed when you're doing this work. And I learned, along the way that, okay, there are certain concepts that I can't say. So I honestly stopped using words like religious trauma in the community
because they would immediately resist.
Because they see that as diseasing them or pathologizing them. And that's just, again, because of the stigma within our culture, that's going to be a hard pass for them. Yeah. So I don't use words like therapy a lot of times, even though I am a mental health professional. I don't use words that are going to cause them to resist me. So that's been part of the journey too, is just trying to create innovative practices and modalities, using those evidence-based approaches, but trying to use them in a way that doesn't further traumatize my community so that they'll get the help that they need.
Yeah.
And it's been quite the challenge doing that.
So you said something that kind of piqued my curiosity. You mentioned there are certain things you can't say because they'll kind of shut down if they feel, I don't know if they're feeling judgment or they're feeling pathologized, but you mentioned some of the language. And I just was curious because I've wondered this before. Is there a difference between using the word counselor, like pastoral counselor, and therapist? Is there a difference there?
Yep. Believe it or not, pastoral counselor sounds way less threatening because of the word pastor. That implies that she's going to use some biblical approaches and some religious approaches. So that's way less threatening than if they just had to hear the word therapy as a standalone. So in my research study, one of the things I'm looking at too is talking to them about their willingness to collaborate with mental health professionals. And my desire is to have conversations with mental health professionals, in the secular space to try to get them to understand the perspective of African Americans and why there is this resistance to trust them. So yeah, oddly enough, it's way less threatening if I say pastoral counselor than if I say therapist.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, actually. I wonder if we could shift into this because you've been talking about this religious and cultural trauma through the Black American experience. I wonder if you could focus on that for a little bit. Can you share with us more? What should we be understanding, or what would you like anyone to understand about that?
So obviously, when we talk about religious trauma, we're talking about just the overwhelming and disruptive patterns of thought and behavior, right? But when you think about it from the African American perspective, as I've alluded to, church is really, really important to the African American community. And I would ask people to just try to be open to understanding the issues with systemic racism in our country. So institutionally and systemically, Black people don't really have anywhere else to go. We have the church. It's the one place that we can go where we feel like we are not the minority, where we feel like our culture is embraced, where we feel as though we can be free to be ourselves. We don't have to worry about code switching, which is where a lot of Black people have to feel they have to act white in order to be accepted. In the church, we don't have to deal with any of that. So we need to understand that when we talk about teaching about religious trauma, because trying to ask a person to deconstruct from the place that might be causing the trauma is difficult, because if this is all I have and you're asking me to consider leaving it or somehow deconstructing from it, that's scary to people. So for us, religious trauma and deconstruction take on a whole other mindset, because we have to work through those layers, which is why I'm trying to focus on talking to clergy, because the clergy are in the place of authority. And if I can get clergy to understand how the doctrines, some of them, and the practices are traumatizing people, then they are in position to make those necessary changes as opposed to the people in the congregations. So for us, it's really important because we wouldn't have anywhere else to go. I started a community for that very reason. I have an online community for people that I funnel them into, because the biggest fear is if I leave church or if I leave my faith, where am I going to go? When I first started deconstructing in 2019, most of the communities I was in, they were white communities. And that's again, because this is not popular in the Black community. Deconstructing and religious trauma, these are not conversations you're going to have readily. So I was in the communities with white deconstructing individuals. And as much as I appreciated them, and I have really wonderful friends from that community, I still felt some of the same issues that I feel when I'm in the world. And it's not their fault, but I still felt that whole minority thing.
Yeah.
I still felt like they didn't really understand my lived experience. I still felt like their journey in deconstruction was not similar to mine. And again, because the reasons why Black people are in church are largely different than the reasons why most white people are in church in the first place.
Mm. Can you speak to some of those differences that you see?
We need it for coping.
Mm-hmm.
Most white people go to church for fellowship or just to sort of, is there a good deed for the week? But they have other things that they participate in. For Black people, no, we go to church because we need God to help us. We need God to help heal us. We need God to solve our problems for us. We need God to help us pay bills. Like we really see God in that way because we don't have conversations a whole lot about self-efficacy and self-agency. For a lot of us in the Black community, the reliance is on God. And we've been taught that God is at the church. So our reasons for going there are different. Again, we're also going there as a way to escape,
Mm-hmm.
The pressure we feel at work. I remember before I started my business, I worked at a social services agency and I was one of 5 African Americans in the entire agency in that county.
Mm.
And I just remember all day long, I code switched all day because when I acted, and I'm putting up quotes like y'all can see because this is a podcast, but whenever I would act in my Black culture is different. You see me now moving my hands, doing all the things. Whenever I would act that way, like my supervisor she'd be nervous and she would think I was trying to be difficult and I would go home and cry. So I learned how to code switch at work. I learned how to act like white people so that they wouldn't misunderstand my intention.
Mm.
So Sunday, when it was time to go to church, or Wednesday night for Bible study, let's go. I was so happy to have a place that I could go to and be my authentic self. I could talk the way that I knew how to talk. I could praise God the way that we do in our culture.
Mm-hmm.
So for us, it's a safe haven too, because all of the systems in our country, they're white centered. And I know that might be hard to hear. And I'm not saying it to be disrespectful, but it is what it is. So church for Black people is the place that we can escape the systemic racism that we deal with on a daily basis. And trying to get individuals to hear us. It's so difficult because, Darren, when he had me on his show, Darren Slade, we were talking about that. And he said, he was playing devil's advocate with me. And he said, can you understand, Vanessa, how white people feel like we're being attacked for things that we didn't do? And I do feel I understand it to a certain degree. But I said to him, do you understand, though, how we feel when our laws and every major system in this country is governed by white men primarily, right? And that's just the truth. We've only had one African American president in this country, right? So everywhere we go, every major institution, it is governed primarily by white patriarchy, which also governs Christianity, by the way. So for us, the church is that place that we can go to sort of escape that world. But at the same time, and this is where I get in trouble with the church, but we're also adapting some of those same patriarchal doctrines at our Black church.
So the place where you're going for solace and peace also has weaved into the system its own trauma is what you're naming.
Yes.
Like the trauma is just kind of weaved right in there to the very place where you're trying to go for peace and solace and healing.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So it's just a catch-22. So we're just really just re-traumatizing ourselves every time we go. And the amazing thing is when I begin to talk to people, including my own journey, when I ask them these qualitative questions and these Socratic questions, and eventually the light bulb comes on and they realize, oh, wait a minute. All the problems that I'm talking about stem from my religion. For example, in rigid religions, authoritarian religions, what most of the world would see as just natural human behavior is seen as sin. So you're not supposed to indulge in sexual activities unless you're married. You're not supposed to be consuming alcohol. Of course, we're not talking about alcoholism. We're just talking about social drinking. That's prohibited. Just watching a movie in many spaces is prohibited.
Mm.
So I could go on and on and on. And so with religious trauma, we end up with people who have trouble making decisions on their own because now they can't rely on God making the decision for them, or they can't rely on their pastor making the decision for them, because it happens a lot in the church. Now we have interpersonal relationships that are at stake, because now my relationships and friendships are not necessarily centered around our shared faith. So how do I go into the world and have new friendships and develop new friendships that are not faith-centered? So then there's a problem. I experienced that too. You have social alienation and social isolation. How do I navigate my health now that I'm deconstructing, right? Because in these authoritarian religions, oftentimes these are things that we put on the altar. We expect God to heal diabetes and cancer and heart attacks and all these things. So just trying to get people to make everyday decisions about where to work, what career path to take. I see people get very overwhelmed and very distressed when they're asked to make decisions where they're not allowed to rely on those toxic and traumatizing doctrines anymore.
Yeah.
So it's very, very sad, to watch.
And I'm just, in hearing your experience, you were essentially employed by the church, or you were the pastor. So I'm thinking about how hard that must have been, or difficult that must have been for you to step away, because it wasn't only your church, it was also your employment and your social connections and all of these things. And the reason I'm highlighting that is because I recently spoke with someone else who, similar thing, they stepped away from their church and they had been employed by the church. And they were just saying how difficult that was, because every element of their life had to deconstruct. It wasn't just them changing their understanding of God and those aspects. It was every single, and that's what I hear you naming, is every single aspect of your life is kind of rocked when you change things.
That's a whole different podcast.
That's a whole nother episode.
That's a podcast all by itself.
Yeah.
Because that was definitely what I had to go through, and I have a whole different conversation with pastors and leaders who are deconstructing, because it's a completely different monster. Everything is gone. I lost a lot. I lost my friends. I lost my supposed reputation as a woman of God. People were now looking at me like I was a criminal. It was I'm about to cry now. It was very, 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 very hurtful and very, very, very difficult. But yeah, it's a complete deconstruction, not just of your faith. Because the thing of it is, it was easier for me to keep God than to deal with all the other stuff that came with that. So, just dealing with all of the backlash and the isolation and trying to get people to understand, and then your family looking at you like you're crazy. And it's a lot. It is a lot to take in.
Yeah. Well, one thing you just said that kind of leads me into another question I wanted to ask you about. It was easier for you. Well, this piece about God, I guess what I'm curious about is, how can you differentiate, or how do you differentiate working with religion and spirituality? Can you talk to us a little bit about how you differentiate, and maybe how you guide clients through that, process of understanding and kind of untangling what is the difference between my spirituality and my religion, or my former religion?
That's a great question. It's the first question that they ask me. So when you look at like a textbook definition of religion comes with a code book. Religion says you have to believe certain tenets. You have to practice faith a certain way. You have to adhere to the indoctrination, what you're being taught. You have to adhere without questioning it. That's what's called faith. So I describe it as it's a prescription. It's already prescribed for you. So what you have to do is you have to memorize the prescription, because everything's already laid out for you. You're not involved in your relationship with God at all. You're not involved in your spiritual journey at all. You're not involved in that. So it's a very mindless journey. Spirituality, at least from my perspective, is throwing the code book in the trash can. Did I just say that out loud? Yeah, I did. It's
You did.
it's throwing the code book in the trash can. It's throwing the rules in the trash can. It's throwing the entire prescription in the trash can. And it's you standing in your own power. It's you standing in your own divine authority. It's you connecting to God in a way that is completely your own. So I have people who end up in a eclectic mix of spirituality. I have some people who say, I don't want anything to do with anything that looks like God.
Mm.
And I have other people who say, like myself, who are willing to let's redefine God. Because, I'm going to say this, I hope I don't get in trouble. Christianity is just one definition of God.
Mm-hmm.
And I tell my clients and my students, as much as I try not to disrespect Christianity, Christianity is only a couple thousand years old. People have been practicing faith and spiritual traditions for as long as we've had an earth, right? So I teach them to go beyond, or we go pre-Christianity, to look at other examples of what faith could look like. And I invite people into a time of self-reflection and introspection where they're able to now create a practice that feels safe to them. They're able to redefine what God is to them. Some people choose to throw the word God out altogether. They'll say things like source, or they'll say things like the divine, or they'll say things like spirit, because I have a lot of African American clients, but I do have white clients too. But I have a lot of African American clients who prefer to go back to their African practices.
Mm.
And so we invite people into this world of self-discovery. And once they heal that trauma, because they have to do that first,
Mm-hmm.
but once they're able to manage that trauma and they know how to work through the trauma, they get really excited about the opportunity to now create for themselves a brand new spirituality. In essence, and this is going to sound so blasphemous to some people, but they get to rewrite their own Bible, and they get to rewrite it in a way that feels good to them. And I try to guide them on the journey of not just self-efficacy and self-agency, but doing that unapologetically and helping them to actualize to their highest potential, which includes being free of being controlled by the opinions of other people.
Mm-hmm.
That is the highest form of agency to me. It's knowing that you are now in full control of your own life, and you don't have to worry about the fear of God getting you, because that's part of the journey of navigating deconstruction. We have to also overcome the anthropomorphic ideology of God that was given to us, right?
Yeah.
So helping them to see that there is a way to embrace the fullness of a higher force that's not punitive, that's not tyrannical, that is not here to harm you or traumatize you. Over time, through mindfulness practices, through learning how to breathe through the trauma, I have seen so many people, dozens of people, get on a new path to spirituality where they learn to pray again.
Mm.
Listen, I didn't pray for 3 years. For 3 years, I stopped praying. I couldn't, because I didn't know how do I pray to the God that I feel harmed me, right? But I know how to pray again now in a way that feels good to me. So just watching people pray again, meditate again, watching people, guiding them through the journey of connecting to God through nature,
Mm.
grounding, teaching them to walk, just to walk in the earth and just, allow the wind to blow through their hair, or just to go down to the water and just to sit still with nature. These are things that are new for people in the African American community, because we were not taught to be present with nature. We were not taught to be present in our bodies. We were
Mm.
not taught to listen to what our body is feeling. We were not taught to listen to God through nature. So these are new but very exciting principles and practices that I can guide my clients in. And it's so rewarding to watch people be able to craft out a spiritual practice that's not harmful and debilitating and traumatizing.
Mm. Gosh, there were several things you said there that really jumped out at me, but I'm just really appreciating in this moment, like the work that you're doing is actually reconnecting folks with their divine, their God. And what's sad is that so many are maybe afraid to explore that because it feels like it's outside of the box of what they were taught to do. I know I've mentioned conversations a lot, and these are people who have said that they're happy to have their experiences shared. But one woman was saying she grew up similarly, that it was a rule that she wasn't allowed to drink. And so when she stepped away from, her faith tradition that she grew up in, she talked about how she went through this whole decision-making process that you mentioned, like how hard it is to, what does it mean now that I don't have this specific list, and deciding to not drink or to drink or whatever for herself, how important those decisions were. And in NARM, we talk about the importance of agency. And she said it was interesting as I kind of went through the list of things, there were actually things that I did choose. She ended up choosing to not drink for, some of her own health reasons. And she said, what's interesting is that choice, it feels so different now because it's my agency. I'm actually making that. It's a choice for me. And then other things that she decided to let go that kind of didn't land on the list anymore. And again, how important that agency was for her, and that the choices that she decided, even the things that she decided to keep with her, that things that she had learned growing up, that she felt so much more intentional about it and more connected to those practices because they were her choice, not just because something that she was sort of blindly following. And that's really stuck with me. I think how valuable that is. And you named the agency piece, so I wanted to highlight that.
Yeah, I just wanted to piggyback because you were talking about the individual you were working with and the experience in choosing. Because one of the things, and we were talking about self-agency, and one of the things that I see on this journey with people who don't quite understand this journey, they assume that when individuals deconstruct and get into a spiritual journey, that people just want to sin, right? And nothing could be further from the truth. What people really want to do is exactly what you described, is people want to make their own decisions. Because here's the thing, I'm not practicing sin. I don't think people understand the importance of just being able to make decisions for yourself, using your own intuition, using your own autonomy, using your own self-governance. So I get to decide, and telling my clients that too, like, you get to decide if you want to date, and if you want to be intimate or not. You don't have to be, but you get to make those decisions. You get to decide if you want to, give your money to a church or tithe or not. You can, like, just to be able to make the decisions without the fear of some type of judgment has been so incredibly healing to a lot of people that I work with in this space. So I just wanted to just kind of piggyback on that.
Yes, the agency piece, it's really healing. And you speaking to this piece about owning our choices, to me that feels sacred. I don't know that everyone would use that word, but it does. It feels sacred, and agency feels sacred to me. And if you believe in the divine or God or however, whatever, word you use for that, I feel that that's a sacred,
Woo.
thing that we've been given. So
I agree. And that's what, I get these people who they're always asking me about, God. And I wrote a book. It's a really short ebook. It's about 11 pages. And the name of the book is What Book Should I Read?
hmm.
And I wrote that book because it's the question that people always ask me. Well, what book should I read to find God? And I think the first place and the best place, and maybe even the only place to find God, is within yourself,
Mm.
right? So I think this work that we're doing is very spiritual, and people are always wanting me to define spirituality. I think they're expecting some deep mystical definition. But I think when a person can practice self-efficacy and agency and autonomy, and when people can learn to trust themselves, and when people can learn to love themselves and feel safe with themselves, I don't know if it gets more sacred and spiritual than that. So I don't have this incredibly deep, you know, mystical definition for spirituality other than, in the words of Jesus, God is within. That's what I try to teach people and guide them on this journey of self-discovery, is finding the sacredness within your own soul. Because I think that's part of trauma healing too. Trauma doesn't just affect us physically. It's not just a physiological response to, events, but it's also, I think, the imprints that trauma leaves on our soul. And so reconnecting with your soul, I think, is a part of this healing journey as well. And that's the part that I try to focus on. in my practice more than anything else.
That's a beautiful place to start wrapping up. And Vanessa, I just want to thank you for your time and your generosity. I know it's taken a minute for us to be able to connect and have this conversation. So I really appreciate you taking the time. And I wondered if you could share with our listeners where they can find you and track down your work and all of that.
Absolutely. I'm all over the internet, child.
All right.
So probably the best place to find me, I have a website. It's www.vanessaRbrooks.com. And I have a relatively growing presence on an app called TikTok. It's Becoming Dr. Vanessa on TikTok. And I am all over Facebook at Vanessa R. Brooks. So find me there. Oh, and there's a secondary website specifically focused on the religious trauma and deconstruction conversations, and that's lifeafterchurch.org.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Vanessa. I really appreciate this conversation. I know that it's really given me some things to think about, and I'm sure our listeners will enjoy it as well. So thank you.
And thank you, Emily, for the opportunity to share my work with you. I really appreciate it, and I appreciate you giving me an opportunity to talk to your audience as well.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for joining us for today's episode. To find more information about our guest, check the show notes or visit us at complextraumatrainingcenter.com/transforming trauma. You can also connect with us in other ways. We're on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube. If you're a licensed mental health professional working with complex trauma and are interested in learning the neuroaffective relational model, we're excited to share with you about our upcoming NARM therapist trainings. The Level 2 training is a clinical training where you will get trained in a comprehensive developmental framework and clinical approach for resolving the long-term impacts of ACEs and CPTSD. As you learn and integrate NARM, you will receive individualized support and join an engaged professional community of therapists passionate about healing complex trauma. Learn more about this training and reserve your spot by visiting www.complextraumatrainingcenter.com. The Complex Trauma Training Center emphasizes professional development in support of personal growth. We provide clinical trainings, online webinars, ongoing consult groups, mentorship programs, and community events. Our mission is to provide a relational, inclusive, and depth-oriented professional community for those seeking a supportive network of therapists working with complex trauma. To learn more about our trainings, programs, and events, please visit us on our website at complextraumatrainingcenter.com. Thanks to Andrea Klunder and the Creative Imposter Studios for producing and editing, to Elisa Sponseller for our album art, and to Brad Kammer for the creation of this podcast. We look forward to building community and connection with you and changing the world by transforming trauma.